I genuinely believe that the skinhead subculture must be the most fractured subculture out of all of the subcultures. Say subcultures more cow subcultures, but honestly, anytime I see a post on, say, like TikTok about skinheads, the amount of discourse in the comment section is unreal. People thinking they're all far-right weapons that will crack your jaw and then steal your Doc Martens. There is so much discourse. Are you a bonehead? Are you a sharp? What lace color do you choose? I'm serious. I'm literally seeing this all the time on like every skinhead TikTok I see. And then after going to multiple forums, talking about skinheads, seeing what people were saying, watching videos on skinheads, going through thousands and thousands of comments of people giving their personal accounts of being in the skinhead community back in like the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. And that's when it truly hit me. The conversation around skinheads is so messy and so divided. It's a topic where misinformation is so incredibly rampant. And the people, even those within the subculture today, seem to have wildly different understandings of what being a skinhead actually means. So in this video, we're going to have a very good crack at untangling this web of confusion. We'll dive into the history of the subculture, its evolution, and to like why it's been so fragmented and now we are seeing so much discourse on TikTok. You know how the history of skinheads is so vast and strong and real and so present in modern day media that when we see a skinhead on TikTok, it normally just ends with discourse, arguing, and what it means to be a skinhead. Let's try and understand this complex conversation, shall we? But before we do get into this conversation, let me introduce myself so I'm not just a random man ranting at you on the internet. My name is Cal, and on this channel we do videos talking about things we see on the internet, and then we all discuss it as a community down below in the comment section, all sharing our thoughts and opinions. There is never a pressure to agree, just be respectful when sharing your opinion. Also, side note, I'm wearing a Fred Perry jacket. It's the closest thing I had that was kind of associated to the subculture, and you know, also belonged to my brother, so it's nice to have it on show for the world. Anyways, back on with the video. First, I think we should dive into the origins of the skinhead subculture. And I would like to actually say, like, if you are a skinhead yourself and you're watching this video, or you know, you've got a lot of knowledge on the subculture, please, please, please share your history and your experiences down in the comment section below. We have done many videos on this channel about subcultures, and I found the best way that I've learned from these videos, and others have, is from people from these actual movements coming down and sharing their experiences, like first-hand experiences. That is so useful, and it's always great to learn from people. So the story of skinheads you've probably heard 1,000 times before, but you know, maybe you can sprinkle some of your own information throughout this part. To understand the skinhead culture, we need to go back to 1960s in Britain. Well, actually, we need to go back earlier than that. We actually need to go back to 1948, when the British Nationality Act gave people from colonies the right to live and work in Britain. And you may be thinking at this point, Cal, what does this have to do with the 1960s and skinheads? Well, it played a contributing factor into what we now know as the traditional skinhead. Basically, in the 60s, we had multiple other subcultures going on. As to assume and say skinheads is the very first subculture ever would just be silly and ill-informed, right? In truth, the humble beginnings of what we now know as the traditional skinhead came from working class solidarity, pride, and like a complete rejection of softer aesthetics and ways of life being pushed by the, at the time, popular subcultures. You know, there was this collection of people that no longer resonated with the groups they were part of. One of the big notable subcultures during the 50s, during the 60s, were the mods, aka modernists. These mods were basically fashionable, trendy people who would save up and spend a lot of their money on clothes. They would also go to venues, and a big thing they would listen to is modern jazz, and mainstream media loves to paint the picture that if you were a mod, you had to have a moped. However, what I have seen in many forums is many mods from this era will actually dispute this, saying many mods just didn't have mopeds, so what they did do is all go in cars together, as that makes more sense. Now, the subculture we know as mods, as all subcultures do, eventually splintered off into various offshoots. And one of those offshoots was the hard mod, who wanted absolutely nothing to do with the peacocky nature of what mod was becoming. You know, this soft mod, this peacocky mod, was very much a form over substance based aesthetic. So this group, dubbed the hard mods, opted for something far more practical for their everyday wear. A strong working boot, often opting for shorter hair as opposed to something contemporary, stylish and soft. And before the term term skinhead came about to describe this collection of hard mods, you will see a lot of other terms used to describe this collection of people who were very workwear orientated and had short cropped hair. Terms such as peanuts, boiled eggs, and bother boys were all terms kind of thrown around to describe this set of people. And now, team, I can finally go back to the significance of 1948 and the British Nationality Act. Amongst the people who had immigrated to Britain were Jamaicans. In London, British working class people found their lives intertwining with young working class Jamaicans. You know, picture this, they're working at the same companies, naturally you talk to one another, you end up hanging out in the same spaces after work, your lives become integrated, right? And what we began to see was culture sharing and culture appreciation. And these young Jamaicans at the time had their own style as well. And this was called the Jamaican rude boy aesthetic. Not only were the British introduced to this rude boy aesthetic, but also introduced the British public on a more wider scale to Jamaican rocksteady, reggae and ska. Both the hard mods and the rude boys rejected the dominant subcultures at the time. They did not resonate with them. Their values and beliefs didn't fit with the soft mods or the hippies. And through this rejection and solidarity, boom, zooey mama, we get skinheads. And what we now refer to as traditional skinheads. Simple as that, people coming together with a shared understanding of each other, all united under the sound of music. I don't mean like the sound of music like the musical, I mean the parties involved all got amongst it and listened to Jamaican ska, you know, rocksteady, reggae. This is what they would be putting on at the social venues. Boom, traditional skinhead. The iconic aesthetic, and this is the genre of music typically associated to skinheads. I think the really important thing to note with the skinhead movement is, although the subculture, you know, was mainly linked to the music and the fashion, the aesthetic associated with it, the skinhead scene symbolized more than that. In truth, it symbolized solidarity, where, you know, many working class neighborhoods were very diverse, and skinheads represented a unique blend of influences from all the communities within your neighborhood. I suppose it's also kind of important to note that the adoption of, you know, Jamaican ska wasn't like the appropriation in the modern sense. I know as a world now we are far more aware about having conversations about cultural appropriation, but this was a true appreciation and shared love for the music that united people. I realize I'm now starting to sound like the script to a Disney movie. We were all coming together, it was beautiful. And you know, if the story could just end there, well, we would literally all be doing knee slides across the dance floor listening to our favorite Jamaican ska. However, in truth, this is only the start of a very turbulent story of the skinhead. What we have just talked about and defined is the traditional skinhead, an apolitical movement, meaning it had no political agenda. It was just people coming together for a shared appreciation of a certain aesthetic and music. But this isn't the only variant on what skinhead became associated with, as the skinhead subculture would quickly become divided due to, well, politics being brought into it. Before we get onto the political history attached to the skinhead subculture, there are a couple of acknowledgements I want to make. Firstly, I could do a whole nother video on the evolution of the music surrounding the skinhead culture. You know, how it evolved through the 70s and the 80s onward. So instead of just rushing through it because it's not key to this conversation, if that is a topic that interests you, let me know and we can explore that as a video concept. The aim for this video was to basically just establish the framework of the first wave skinhead, you know, so that we could understand its fracturing. Secondly, I do think it's super important to point out that it simply was not just all sunshines and rainbows for the people who immigrated to Britain under the British Nationality Act. I am aware that in telling the story of how the skinhead subculture came about, it can really make it seem or paint a picture of complete wholesomeness. Everybody just welcomed these new people to our shores, and then, you know, from there it was non-stop ska parties. This is far from the truth. As soon as the first Windrush boat touched down on British shores, the British public were divided, and you can see this within the comment sections of other videos discussing the skinhead subculture and how it came about. This very vocal minority like to paint this picture that they were never allowed to be here in the first place, and to try and defend this argument, they'll be like, well, the Labour MPs wrote to the Prime Minister. They didn't want people immigrating to Britain either. But you can actually see what the Prime Minister's response to these letters were at the time. 5th of July, 1948. I'm replying to your letter signed by yourself and 10 other members of parliament on the 22nd of June about the West Indians who arrived in this country on that day on board the Empire Windrush. I note what you say, but I think it would be a great mistake to take the immigration of the Jamaican party to the United Kingdom too seriously. It is traditional that British subjects, whether of Dominion or colonial origin, and of whatever race or colour, should be freely admissible to the United Kingdom. This tradition is not, in my view, to be lightly discarded, particularly at this time when we are importing foreign labour in large numbers. It would be fiercely resented in the colonies themselves, and it would be a great mistake to take any measure which would tend to weaken the goodwill and loyalty of the colonies towards Great Britain. Basically, there had been a lot of fear-mongering that the people immigrating to Britain would not be productive members of society. But the Prime Minister goes on to refute this claim. It may be of interest to you to know that of the 236 who had nowhere to go and no immediate prospects of employment, and who therefore temporarily accommodated a Clapham shelter, 145 had actually been placed in employment by the 30th of June, and the number still resident in the shelter at this last weekend was down to 76. It would therefore be a great mistake to regard these people as undesirable or unemployables. Yeah, and if you are kind of lost here and you're starting to wonder what this has to do with skinheads, what this has to do with Britain, basically, Britain used to have an empire. The British Empire. And by 1913, Britain ruled over 400 million people all around the world. The British Empire ruled over these people, forcibly taking control and often imposing British law and customs, meaning the people that were native to these countries lost their autonomy, lost the ability to govern themselves. An example of this was Jamaica, which was part of the British Empire until it gained independence in 1962. In 1833, the British Empire abolished slavery. So you think, oh yay, finally doing the morally and ethically correct thing, right? Well, no. This is because it did not actually free the enslaved people. The people of Jamaica were forced to work as unpaid apprentices for their former masters. And then the British rulers at the time in Jamaica were then concerned that these people that were once enslaved could now vote in, elections and threaten their power. So in 1838, British governors of Jamaica made plans to introduce a law which meant that only people who owned property in Jamaica could vote. And what this did is it allowed British control to continue and prevented a large portion of native Jamaican people from voting. And now to circle back to the British Nationality Act and how it impacted people from former British colonies, is it formalised their status as British subjects, meaning they had rights to work and reside and have access to public services within Britain. And as aforementioned, some people in Britain were very against this. And I think David Lammy added really good nuance to this conversation. I'm here because you were there. We are here because you were there. My ancestors were British subjects, but they were not British subjects because they came to Britain. They were British subjects because Britain came to them, took them across the Atlantic, colonized them, sold them into slavery, profited from their labor, and made them British subjects. That is why I'm here. That is why the Windrush generation are here. But this, in a very basic, simplified way, shows the trials and the tribulations of the people who immigrated to Britain under the British Nationality Act. There is collections of people such as the Windrush generation, which you can read about if you want to learn more about this matter. I think what this mini history lesson does do is it sets up a good basis for understanding why a portion of skinheads could get radicalized by right-wing ideologies. As even from day one of the Windrush boat arriving on British shores, some people did not want to welcome immigration to Britain. And even within the skinhead subculture, people will reference a song, Skinheads Abash Them, to make the case that some skinheads, although they may have accepted people from Jamaica, were very racist towards people from Pakistan. Also, side note, if you are going to go listen to that song, it does refer to people from Pakistan by a derogatory term. But yes, with this framework in place, let's explore politics within the skinhead subculture. During the 70s and 80s, deindustrialization occurred across the UK. Due to technological change and globalization, Britain found itself moving away from its traditional industrial base of manufacturing and moving more towards service-based industries such as finance, healthcare, and technology. Many working in factories and docks no longer had job security. They were told they had to get a new job, train up in a new skill, find something else to do. I can even give a personal anecdotal story to this. My grandfather, who had worked on the docks for a large majority of his life, was basically told this job's not gonna be here much longer, so he had to move to a completely different part of the country and change his career path. And obviously, he was fortunate to be able to do that. Not everybody would have been able to have done that. And this, of course, led to a lot of anger and upset within society, specifically because it targeted a lot of the working class. Deindustrialization destroyed workers' movements. Goodbye trade unions. Famous examples of this is the miners striked on multiple occasions, and ultimately they got shut down by the government. So over the 70s and 80s, thousands were left without clear career paths. Class separation between, the working and middle class became more noticeable. The working class were being left behind in this changing landscape. On top of that, even within mainstream politics, politicians like Enoch Powell began spouting very far-right ideologies about immigration.
This country, in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man.
This speech actually happened in the late 60s, but it did set up for the social and political landscape that was to come in the 70s and 80s. With people being left without guaranteed futures within their chosen careers, a large portion of the working class felt disillusioned and left behind by society. And whilst this was going on, during the 60s and well into the 70s, immigration continued. Historically, during times of economic turmoil and social unjust, this is when extreme political parties can gain popularity. And boom, hey presto, income groups like the National Front, which by the way is like a far-right political group. Basically what the National Front did is they saw this as the perfect opportunity to exploit the frustrations of the working class. And because, the skinheads were originally a working class subculture, the National Front targeted them for recruitment. What the National Front did was they would turn up to shows where skinheads were and try to recruit them, try to radicalize them. They would even go on to put on their own shows called Rock Against Communism and have their own racist bands like Screwdriver. The National Front really took this as an opportunity to take hold of the skinhead subculture. In these times of economic stress, where people are out of work, where they're fighting to pay bills, the National Front were offering simple answers to complex questions. And this is like an age-old thing extremist political groups have always done. They'll feed on your pain, they'll feed on your insecurities, and boom, next thing you know, a portion of these skinheads were now hurting, attacking, even killing. The National Front fearmongered by putting a lot of blame for social and economic issues on basically anyone that wasn't white and British. And whilst all of this was going on, the National Front were out there protesting, recruiting skinheads. Groups were set up to oppose the National Front, like the Anti-Nazi League. The Anti-Nazi League made it very clear they opposed the National Front and what they were doing and how they were trying to radicalize people. Just as the National Front had Rock Against Communism, people who were anti-far right, anti-National Front, anti-fascism set up a group called Rock Against Racism. And then eventually in the 80s, skinheads would create their own groups to clearly separate themselves from this stigma of skinheads being this alt-right racist group. They came out and created groups like the Sharps, Skinheads Against Racial Prejudice. And I should mention, basically all the people in the skinhead movement that opposed these far-right, these neo-Nazis, these racist people, coined a term for this group, boneheads. And this term has stuck like glue. And although these efforts worked to undoubtedly make it clear that society didn't need the National Front, the working class didn't need the National Front, that is clear because obviously we'd live in a very different world right now if the National Front did manage to galvanize all the working class. Clearly, it wasn't like that at all. As most could see through what the National Front was doing, they could see that it was a racist agenda. It was blaming marginalized communities for economic and social shortcomings. However, what these groups like the Anti-Nazi League and Rock Against Racism didn't manage to stop was what skinheads, the subculture, would be predominantly perceived as in mainstream media. During the 70s and into the 80s, many times the National Front would protest and march, it often ended violently. And who did the media start pointing out was at a lot of these marches? These so-called skinheads. These people with short hair, boots, this very distinctive look. And therefore the media took this and they would make articles talking about skinheads, talking about the National Front. And this started shaping the public's opinion, the public's perception on skinheads. On top of this, when researching for this video, many people pointed out that there was a genuine portion of skinheads, even from the very early 70s, that would target South Asians in violent attacks. And this is irrefutable. I quickly found multiple media documents supporting this. And clearly this doesn't mean all skinheads. However, this was a very real, irrefutable problem that was clearly going to make the news when talking about skinheads. I should also mention, during this time when the National Front was very active and recruiting within the skinhead scene, at some point during this, it turned into a full-blown neo-Nazi thing. At marches, people would literally be throwing up this salute. This could no longer be described as a political movement. We're doing this to make Britain great again. This was just outright hatred and racism. In the latter waves of the skinhead movement, there was a genre of music called oi music, which the skinhead movement adopted. And even though bands like Sham 69 were not like overtly far right or like neo-Nazis in their lyrics, their songs were just catchy, easy to sing along with, as they incorporated like football style chants. Songs like If the Kids United really captured teenage angst and a sense of wanting to belong. Things that have always been a big part of subcultures. Young people wanting to find a place that resonates with them. And guess who realised this and decided to take advantage of that situation? The National Front began going to Sham 69 gigs and trying to recruit there. And well, this snowballed into the stigma of Sham 69 gigs ending in violence. And well, the band ultimately ended up performing less. But on top of this, there was, however, bands in that genre, like Screwdriver, who would just promote heinous, straight up, undeniable neo-Nazi ideologies. And this neo-Nazi skinhead movement actually ended up going international. It went across to America, in Europe, and it's still an active problem all over the world. These neo-Nazis that co-opted the skinhead aesthetic, they completely ignore the fact that the original traditional skinhead movement was about, Jamaicans and the British coming together and having a shared love for like reggae and ska. No. How can you be that disconnected, honestly? But back to England, as these National Front protests went on and on and on, and more of them ending in violent outcomings, more people getting hurt. This was the news that would make headlines, would make the mainstream media when talking about skinheads. Because the trad skinheads, the traditional skinheads, who were just getting along and listening to ska, that's not going to make the news. People getting along, that's not newsworthy. I know to us it might be, and for people that care about what the original movement was, we'll be like, yeah, that matters. But to mainstream media who are not involved in that subculture, they've got this wave of people who are doing crimes against society and are very violent and outwardly racist. So over the course of the 70s and 80s, there became like this general consensus amongst people that the skinhead movement was indeed racist. And another critical component in the fall of grace from the traditional skinhead was the skinhead's attachment to the hooliganism football era. Basically, in this same time period, the 70s and 80s and onwards, still to this day actually, football had a big hooligan problem, fighting problem. Basically, fans would go to games. They'd go to the games under the guise of being fans, but they'd actually go there to scrap the rival team's fans. And guess who happened to be at those things? Sometimes skinheads. So when skinheads weren't being attached to far-right political movements like the National Front, they were being attached to being violent, being fighty. And the National Front were very tactical. They knew skinheads were going to football games, and they would actually sell the National Front magazine at the football games to these people. And this was another method they used to radicalize people. And this is just wild, isn't it? The skinhead movement started off as this apolitical movement. So to join it, your political opinions didn't really matter, right? As long as you listened to the music and wore this look, you're a skinhead, that's fine. And I suppose because of that, because there was no like preconceived political opinions attached to the movement, it meant basically anybody could have come in, adopt the look, and if they went out and did outwardly political things like, being part of the National Front, and, that makes the news, that makes mainstream media, and on top of that, you're going to football games and you're fighting, the media then takes the skinhead name, the umbrella of it, and says, okay, they're violent, they're far right, this is a danger to society. And that is how society ended up being so scared of the skinhead, and that's why the skinhead is now like so shunned in society. When you ask like people that haven't really looked into the subculture, what are your opinions, what are your thoughts on skinheads, they're often like, aren't they super racist? I'm not denying that skinheads back in the day got into fights, you know. Let's look at the mods and the rockers. In that same time period, they were just a little bit before, in that same time period, they were also getting to fights and skirmishes. You know, I do not refute that people in subcultures occasionally clash and fight each other, maybe because they're rival groups, they're rival gangs, and they butt heads and they fight. Yeah, this is a thing that happens in these spaces, or at least it did happen a lot more back in the day. However, how media marketed it as all skinheads were this violent thing, by the time they had been shaped as this far-right, scary movement, and they had this violent tendency attached to them, that was the final nail in the coffin that would then go on to shape the consensus. It's hard to come back from far-right, then turned into neo-Nazis, throwing up literal salutes, even at football games, and you're just straight up violent, you've hurt people, you've hurt so many people. Yeah, the media took all these events and made this what all of skinhead subculture was about. And obviously it goes without saying, this goes far bigger than the subculture movement. This talks about real world injustices that occurred. But in that same breath, we acknowledge that like, this snowball effect, what started out as different people coming together and culture sharing and swapping, a very racially inclusive thing, ended up being the face, or as at least how, you know, mainstream media shows it, the face of far-right violent movements. And this is now, when we get onto TikTok, why there is so much discourse when skinheads post online, because it's not just them interacting with their localized community of, you know, trad skins or sharps or whatever. People that aren't too familiar with the subculture will just see the skinhead on the screen and be like, where have I heard stories, or where have I read articles, or where have I seen movies about skinheads? And then you're like, oh yeah, bad people, right? And this is what we're going to look at now. The skinhead conversation on TikTok. And oh goodness, is this a conversation. And whilst there are, you know, skinheads on TikTok trying to do their thing, trying to talk about the history, you know, being pretty harmless, it's very clear they're like trad skins, you know, they're just the traditional skins that love the original music and the aesthetic. Do you know what we also have? Boneheads. And there really does seem to be a lot of boneheads on TikTok. This isn't even a joke. I don't know if it's just like a lot of young lads with like edgy humor, and they don't realize that the internet doesn't exist in the vacuum, and then what you say on Do Online actually has real life ramifications, right? And I don't know if they're just leaning into this edgelord humor and cosplaying as boneheads, but you see a lot in these skinhead comment sections, just boneheads, just being outrageous. So you'll see like a lot of skinheads show solidarity on their posts and come up 161 to show, you know, they are anti-fascist, they are anti-racist. And then the boneheads will dog whistle and say 1161, which means they're anti that. So they're like for it, which is obviously not good. Without Jamaicans, without people not from Britain, you never would have got your skinheads. It is all thanks to people coming from elsewhere. It's what made it great. We would never have had skinheads if it wasn't for, you know, the Windrush people. Here is a video from a sharp skinhead trying to educate people on skinheads. You know, trying to set the record straight.
Hi, my name's Nate. I'm what you call a sharp skinhead. That's what I am. I'm a sharp. And sharp, focus. SHARP stands for Skinheads Against Racial Prejudice. Boots and braces do not make a racist. We stand with Black lives, we stand on anti-fascism and anti-racism, and the term sharp started back in the 80s. So the original skins were never racist until the boneheads, what you guys think real skinheads are, the boneheads took our look, like, back in the fucking 70s. Sharp started out in New York back in, like, 80s and carried through on until this day. So don't judge every skinhead just because they're a skinhead. Ask them about it.
And look, there's clearly so many misconceptions, because somebody commented, you're homophobic, and then the content creator had to reply, no, we're not in the slightest. There's clearly so many misconceptions about skinheads, and I generally don't know how they will fix this. I guess through just more people being skinhead content creators, maybe. But this kind of does bring us on to our next conversation, because somebody says, so aside from the patch, is there any way to tell a sharp away from the skinheads we think of? You know, and what they mean by that is like the racists, the white power people, the neo-Nazis. Because if I'm marching by a skinhead, I'm on high alert. Somebody commented the way they dress, the colour of the laces, and they will wear badges if they're protesting. And this is another complex issue because laces on Doc Martens, you know, which were very much associated with the skinhead aesthetic and also other subcultures. But laces, especially in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, really did represent something. You know, white laces represented white power. You know, red laces represented neo-Nazis. Yellow laces, I'm pretty sure, represent sharps. Laces generally do have a meaning. However, on the internet now, and in modern times, a lot of people argue laces don't have meaning, and this creates a big conversation I see on skinhead videos, because skinhead content creators will post videos and it will be captioned "Lace code is dead," and the comment section is full of so much discourse. Lace code is alive depending on where you go, and then other people are being like, I agree, but I'll still never wear red laces. And there's just lots of people saying different things on whether laces should or should not be used. To be fair, I think just through looking at many subcultures now on the internet, it does seem like the mass majority of people do say lace code is pretty much dead. And you know, this skinhead is saying it's dead, but then there's also people saying it's not dead depending where you go. I think how I would look at that one personally, and this is just my subjective opinion, remember, I think I would just simply ask myself why I would want to wear, you know, the white laces. If you know there's already a lot of confusion around the skinhead aesthetic, and a lot of the general public think you are, you know, racist troublemakers, I would personally err on the side of caution and not have white ladder laces. But, you know, the other aspects of the look I think are really timeless, you know, like the Fred Perry polos. The argument for shoelace code being dead for, like, people that, you know, aren't in the skinhead community or whatever is very valid, because Doc Martens sells Docs with all different colours laces. Look, I can show you 2 pairs of my Docs because I'm always in a pair of Docs. These Docs came with yellow laces. These Docs came with like grey bony colour laces. These are just normal Docs. You wouldn't associate these with skinheads or anything whatsoever. They're just normal fashion pieces. And I've been to all sorts of different music venues with explosions of all different subcultures there. I literally have seen people that do look like the 1960s skinheads there, and I've seen, you know, people that look like OG punks. I've seen people that look like Vivian Esque punks. I've seen everyone. Nobody says anything to me because... Is it because I'm super scary and super intimidating? No, I'm like the most unintimidating man in the world. It's because you look at me and you can clearly tell it's not a political bit. Like, this content creator has done other videos wearing other coloured laces in their boots, and people have been like, what do the lace colours mean? And they replied saying nothing anymore, but in the day it showed what type of skin you were. Yellow for sharp, red for National Front, and white for boneheads. But you know, when he is wearing the yellow laces, lots of people in the comments section are saying, finally a sharp skin on my FYP, and sharp skins, the best people. Truly wish people would learn the difference before coming online and spewing hatred. So, you know, even if lace code is dead, people in the comment sections are identifying that person by the colour of their laces. So that's an interesting one, isn't it? But then again, you could argue, due to the nature of social media, because it's a visual-based app, in that way it can be inferred as more performative. So maybe you are just seeing the yellow and they're like, oh, okay, because we haven't actually spoken to that creator, I'm inferring that they're a sharp because of their laces. And that's probably why a lot of these conversations are happening, because when you see this guy in red laces, because you're not speaking to them or whatever, you're like, oh my, I'm just going to infer that as to what I was told it was once upon a time. Whereas in real life, it's more nuanced than that, I suppose. Maybe, you know, actual skinheads can offer more insight into this, you know, because online it does seem, as I'm now actually just reading more comments, it seems like a lot of people are identifying people by their lace color. If they, you know, if they are presenting like a skinhead, if they look like a skinhead, they're holding them to their lace color. Please generally let me know your insight on that. In real life, I've never seen anybody talk about lace code. Then again, you could be like, Cal, that's because you don't operate in a skinhead majority place. And I'm like, yeah, that's a fair critique. That's a very fair point. But in like the mess of this conversation, I saw this TikTok, which I'm praying is rage bait, you know. It's made there just purely to provoke a reaction, because this one's wild. Well, I thought it was rage bait, but then I clicked on the person's profile that he tagged as his bonehead friend, and they're banned. They're banned. So I'm assuming they did something pretty outrageous to get banned. Tradskin with a bone friends, what? He's my absolute best friend. I would take a bullet for that man. And yeah, he is a full-on bonehead and I'm a full-on trad. Well, that's not a great look, is it? Hey, Cal, you said at the beginning of this thing it was originally apolitical. Yeah, it is, but both those people are picked aside. And the bonehead has some pretty crazy ideologies that, you know, I wouldn't be that comfortable being around. But hey, maybe they just love ska and reggae and all that goodness so much they can overlook that. I don't know. That video just kind of blew my mind, in all honesty. I think the amazing thing with TikTok, but it's almost a big critique of TikTok, it's this place where you can come online and you can just jump in and be part of something. And I think a lot of terms and things get thrown around, and in some cases without fully understanding the origins and context, you know? And it's so hard to tell if people are being edgelords or they actually are, you know, boneheads. I think it's good to see on TikTok that there are trad skins, you know, trad skinheads trying to educate people on what the original movement was about, challenge the preconceived notions people currently have on skinheads. But I suppose because it is a visual-based app, that sometimes leads to the oversimplification of things like shoelace code and like that person's wearing that color. Oh my gosh, the conversation around that. And all of this kind of perpetuates the cycle of misinformation, I suppose. But I think through all of this conversation, what's clear is, well, if you ask someone what a skinhead is, the answer really does just depend on who you ask. Because like I said, I went through hundreds of forums scrolling so many things. Everyone gave different pieces of information. Through researching for this whole thing, every time I found what I thought was like the general consensus, I'd get this like left field point of someone being like, actually it was like this. It's kind of like this minefield. But I think for all of that, you can understand the original intent was to enjoy this music and style. It was about community, you know, people coming together for a shared interest. And for some, it's for fighting for their cause, so they may be part of Sharp. But also in this conversation, because, you know, the aesthetic side did get so popular, for some it is just about going to have a scrap on a Sunday with the lads. What's even worse is that it also got adopted by the far right, and that's why it really did a number on the skinhead public perception. I think modern day skinheads have such a diverse history, but I suppose the beauty of that is they're also part of the history now, so they can help educate others, which is what you see people doing on TikTok, which I think is really a good thing, right? There are those who embrace its multicultural roots and keep it going in their local scene and such, which is really cool. And there are others that, you know, aren't apolitical and they focus on the anti-fascist activism, you know, using that skinhead identity as a statement against hate, which I think is a good, productive thing. But obviously within that acknowledgement, there's always going to be the vocal minority who perpetuate the negative stereotypes. It clearly is a subculture that's been pulled in so many different directions, and therefore it will now mean different things to different people. But by having these conversations, and hopefully in the comment section I'll have skinheads, you know, educating on their experiences within the subculture, it creates a wider, better understanding of skinheads and its roots. But yes, let's discuss. I'm actually really excited to have this conversation in the comment section. Every time I do subculture videos, it's such a lovely privilege to hear from the members of the group we're talking about in that video. So I really welcome it. And if there's any information you feel I've missed out, please, you know, educate me and educate the others. It's always very welcome. But yeah, let's discuss. Bum ba dum bum bum. Team, it is now time for my show and tell. Also, side note, if you're new here, I have a feeling I might get new viewers for this video. At the end of every video, I always just do show and tell, okay? Like, I'll just show something from my collection, whether it's Beyblades, FNAF figures, or like Pokemon cards. I always just show something. And today I want to show you my Gengar backpack. My friend got me this for my birthday last year. It was really cool. Obviously don't wear this outside because, well, I just don't think I would suit this with my aesthetic. And if you are new, you might be like, what, Cal, why are you showing me your Gengar backpack that you don't actually take outside but you have in your house? It's because I think it's a nice way to decompress after videos. Sometimes it's just a good way to chill and switch off after watching a video and maybe commenting your thoughts and opinions. So that's what this part of the video kind of serves purpose for. It just sits on my mirror next to like my Pikachu hat. Anyways, that's what I wanted to show today. I hope you love Gengar. If you don't, this is kind of awkward. I've been your boy Cal. This has been me and my Fred Perry jacket. There'll be another video here if you want to watch another of my videos. I appreciate you watching and I really appreciate you contributing in the comments. And I shall see you all in the next video. Okay, bye.